We're used to thinking of incest as something rare, an extreme deviation. But if you look at history without illusions, the picture is much darker. According to anthropologists, the vast majority of marriages in the past happened between people who were related. And we're not talking about distant relatives. Often these unions stayed within a very tight circle. At the same time, there was a clear divide. For ordinary people, strict rules and taboos applied. But where power began, those rules stopped working. The aristocracy lived by a different set of laws. While the church preached morality, elites married within their own families, turning blood ties into a tool of control. This is the story of a dynasty that pushed that strategy to the limit. They didn't rely on war, they relied on marriage. And at some point, that strategy worked almost too well, until it started destroying them from the inside. We're talking about the Habsburgs. To understand how they rose to power, and why it all ended in disaster, we need to go back to medieval Europe. It was a world with almost no stability. The continent was split into dozens of states, duchies, and territories. The familiar countries we know today didn't exist. Instead, there were constant conflicts and endless wars for land and power. France and England were draining each other in long dynastic wars. What we now call Italy was a patchwork of independent cities. Spain spent centuries fighting over its own territory. And in the center of Europe stood the Holy Roman Empire, vast, but fragmented, where hundreds of rulers formally answered to the emperor, but in reality acted on their own. Against this chaos, life for ordinary people was a constant struggle to survive. Disease, famine, climate shifts, everything worked against them. Epidemics could wipe out half the population in just a few years. Cities emptied. Villages disappeared. But even in these conditions, there was another world, the world of the nobility. If you were lucky enough to be born into an aristocratic family, it didn't mean freedom or happiness. It meant you were part of a system. Your life was planned in advance. You didn't choose who to be with, where to live, or what to do. The family decided everything. The main goal wasn't personal happiness, it was strengthening the family line. Marriage in that system wasn't about love. It was a deal. Cold calculation. Every union was either a step forward, or a risk of losing everything. And it's in this world that the Habsburgs appear. Their beginnings were far from greatness. They were just a minor noble family of landowners in what is now Germany. Later, they would create legends about their noble origins, but the reality was much simpler and far less impressive. One of the earliest known members, Guntram the Rich, became known not for honor, but for greed. He squeezed as much as possible from his lands, forcing peasants to work more and pay more than was typical. Even by the standards of that time, it was considered harsh. But greed wasn't his only trait. He was also known for betrayal. He turned against the emperor and lost his lands because of it. That could have been the end of the family's story. But something unexpected happened. The lands were later returned to his heirs. They were the ones who built the castle that gave the dynasty its name, Habsburg. At the time, it was more of a modest fortress than a symbol of a future empire. But it marked the beginning of a path that would lead them to rule over half of Europe. From the very start, they lacked the main resources: power. They didn't have massive armies or wealth comparable to the greatest houses of that era. But they had something else. They quickly understood one thing: in a world where everyone is fighting, you can win in a different way. The Habsburgs built their strategy around marriage. While others were wasting resources on war, they were looking for advantageous alliances. Wealthy heiresses, powerful families, access to new lands, all of it could be gained without battle. And it worked. Every marriage brought them new territories, new alliances, and new opportunities. Step by step, their influence grew. A key figure in this rise was Rudolf I of Habsburg. He wasn't a perfect ruler. His methods were often harsh, and his decisions ruthless. But he understood power very well. He built alliances, negotiated, bought loyalty, and when needed, used force. But most importantly, he continued the same marriage strategy. And it led to a result that changed everything. In 1273, he became Holy Roman Emperor. For a family that had recently been considered minor, it was an incredible leap. From that moment on, the Habsburgs were no longer just another noble house. They became a major player, one that started setting the rules. And most importantly, they realized that their method worked better than war. That's when the principle that would define their politics for centuries took shape. While others wage war, they marry. And that principle would eventually lead them to the top, and to their downfall. After Rudolf I of Habsburg secured the dynasty's place as one of the major powers in Europe, the Habsburgs became even more cautious, and even more calculated. They didn't try to control everything at once. Their strategy was different. Slowly, step by step, they gathered power through marriages. Each new generation strengthened the family's position by connecting it to other ruling houses. About 100 years passed, and the results became clear. The Habsburgs secured Austria, gained influence in Bohemia, and moved closer to Hungary. They were gradually turning into a dynasty that didn't just take part in European politics, they were shaping it. But the real turning point came at the end of the 15th century. In 1496, a marriage took place that changed the future of all Europe. The Habsburg heir, Philip I of Castile, married the Spanish Princess Joanna of Castile. At first glance, it looked like a typical dynastic union. But there was much more behind it. At that time, Spain was one of the most promising powers in Europe. The union of Castile and Aragon, the completion of the Reconquista, and its growing influence on the global stage made it an extremely attractive target. For the Habsburgs, this marriage was a chance to reach an entirely new level. But this union had another side. Joanna came from a dynasty where marriages between relatives were already common. Her parents were related to each other. It didn't show much physically, but it affected mental health. From the very beginning, the relationship between the couple was unbalanced. Philip was known for his looks, and he used them. For him, marriage was a tool. He wasn't interested in building a relationship, he wanted power. Joanna, on the other hand, was completely consumed by her feelings. At first, it looked like deep love. But over time, her emotions started slipping out of control. Her jealousy grew stronger. Her suspicions became more intense. Any woman near Philip was seen as a threat. Eventually, this turned into real outbursts of aggression. In one episode, she attacked a rival and disfigured her face. Philip quickly realized the situation was getting out of control. And he did what came naturally to him, he left. He abandoned his wife and focused on his political ambitions. For Joanna, this became a breaking point. Her condition rapidly worsened. She stopped taking care of herself and fell into deep apathy. Her behavior became more and more unstable. Later, they were reunited, hoping it would help. But the effect was the opposite. Her dependence on him only grew stronger. She clung to him in every possible way, keeping his belongings, controlling his surroundings, and creating scenes that went to extremes. Then something happened that completely shattered her. Philip died suddenly. His death was quick, illness took him in just a few days. For Joanna, this was the point of no return. She refused to accept reality. Instead of a funeral, something happened that's hard to explain logically. Philip's body was embalmed, and Joanna began traveling with it across the country. At night, she moved with the procession, talked to him, and didn't allow any women near him even after his death. This went on for a long time. And she was pregnant during all of this. Those around her were losing patience. But stopping her wasn't easy. Officially, she was still queen. The situation changed when her son, the future Emperor Charles V, saw her condition. The decision was obvious. She was isolated. In reality, she spent the rest of her life confined, completely cut off from power and from the outside world. She lived like that for decades. Joanna's story became one of the first clear signals that the Habsburg strategy came with a cost. But at that moment, the dynasty was at its peak. Charles V inherited a massive empire. Under his control were Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and colonies in the New World. It was a territory over which, as people said at the time, the sun never sets. He became the most powerful ruler of his era, but with power came fear. An empire of that scale was difficult to hold together. Any mistake could lead to collapse. And that's when Charles made a key realization. If marriages had once been used to expand influence, now they had to be used to preserve it. From that moment on, the strategy changed. The Habsburgs began arranging marriages within their own family. And the first step was taken by Charles V himself. He married his own cousin. At first glance, it seemed logical. Why risk alliances with outside dynasties when everything could be kept within the family? But this decision set in motion a process that would later become catastrophic. Charles had 8 children. But only 3 survived to adulthood. That was already a warning sign. But instead of stopping, the dynasty went further. Daughters were married off to relatives. And the main focus shifted to his son, Philip II of Spain. He was meant to continue the line and preserve the empire. Philip inherited not just power, but his father's mindset. For him, marriage was a tool, nothing more. And his personal life became a clear example of where that logic leads. He married again and again. And almost every time, within the same circle of relatives. Each new union was an attempt to produce an heir and strengthen the dynasty. But with every such marriage, the risk only increased. And the consequences were already starting to show. Philip II's first marriage followed the usual pattern of his dynasty. He married his cousin. The goal was simple: strengthen power and, most importantly, produce an heir. But things didn't go as planned. His wife died very young during childbirth. The child survived, but it quickly became clear that something was wrong. He showed serious physical and mental issues from an early age. Over time, the situation only got worse. The heir became aggressive, unstable, and deeply suspicious. He wasn't just unfit to rule a massive empire, he became a threat within his own family. And at some point, everything crossed the line. He began preparing a conspiracy against his own father. Philip II had no choice. The heir was locked away. He died in confinement, never getting a chance to take the throne. The first marriage ended in disaster. But Philip didn't stop. His next move was even more ambitious. He married Mary I of England, the ruling Queen of England, remembered in history as Bloody Mary. This union opened incredible possibilities. If they had a child, England could have become part of the vast Habsburg Empire. But again, failure. Mary truly fell in love with Philip. For her, it wasn't just politics. But for him, nothing changed. It was still calculation and cold strategy. And again circumstances intervened. An epidemic of an unknown disease swept through England. Thousands died. It hit cities, the nobility, and the most vulnerable alike. Mary didn't survive. There was no heir. The empire was left without a clear future. Philip searched for another solution. His third marriage was to Elizabeth of Valois. Interestingly, he didn't even attend his own wedding in person. He was represented by a proxy, a common practice at the time. But this marriage turned out differently. Philip actually grew attached to his wife. For the first time, something more than political calculation appeared between them. It seemed like things were finally working. But the problem remained the same. They had children, but only daughters. There was still no male heir. Time passed. Pressure increased. And once again, tragedy. Elizabeth died during childbirth. A third marriage, and still no result. For Philip, this became a breaking point. He realized there was no time left. If he didn't secure the future of the dynasty, everything built over centuries could collapse. So he returned to what had worked before. Close-kin marriages. His fourth wife was his own niece. At this point, it wasn't just strategy, it was a last resort. And this time, it worked. a long-awaited heir was born, Philip III of Spain. The dynasty kept control over Spain. But the cost of that decision was higher than it seemed. Because from that moment, close relative marriages stopped being an exception. They became the norm. What used to be a tool for specific situations turned into a system. The Habsburgs began systematically marrying within their own family. Cousins, uncles and nieces, it all became standard practice. The reason was simple. They no longer trusted the outside world. Any alliance with another dynasty meant risk, loss of control, a threat to their power. It felt safer to keep everything inside the family. But there was one problem they either ignored or underestimated. Genetics. At the time, modern science didn't exist. But even without it, people noticed something. Children from these unions were more likely to be born with serious issues. Still, power mattered more. Gradually, much of the European aristocracy moved in the same direction. Dynasties became deeply interconnected, forming a vast network of family ties. Kings, emperors, princes, all of them were linked in some way. But most still maintained some level of diversity. They married into different houses, keeping a balance. The Habsburgs went further than anyone. They closed in on themselves. And that's what began to destroy them. Over time, members of the dynasty started showing the same physical traits. The most famous one, the so-called Habsburg jaw. This wasn't just a cosmetic feature. It was a hereditary deformity passed down through generations. The lower jaw pushed forward, giving the face a very distinct shape. At first, it looked like an odd trait. Then it became a family feature. And eventually, it turned into a sign of a deeper problem. Because the changes weren't just external. With each generation, the number of illnesses, disorders, and developmental issues increased. More children died young. And those who survived were more often unable to live. But by then, stopping was no longer an option. The dynasty had gone too far. Everything they had built depended on this system. And abandoning it meant risking everything. So they continued. And step by step, they moved closer to a point of no return. By the mid-17th century, the consequences of this policy became too obvious to ignore. Spain, the main stronghold of the Habsburgs, was gradually losing its power. It had once been one of the richest empires in the world. Streams of gold and silver from the New World seemed endless. But behind that surface wealth was a different reality. The economy wasn't developing. Money was spent on wars, the royal court, and art. Industry lagged behind. The state sank deeper and deeper into debt. An empire that controlled massive resources was, paradoxically, becoming weaker. And at the same time, the dynasty kept doing the very thing that was slowly destroying it. Close relative marriages didn't stop. In fact, they became almost the only option. Over several generations, the genetic line of the Spanish Habsburgs narrowed to a critical point. Nearly all marriages happened within a small circle of relatives. The consequences were no longer isolated cases, they became a pattern. Child mortality in the royal family increased. So much so that even ordinary peasants had better survival rates. And that's despite the fact that the nobility had better living conditions and access to the best medicine of their time. But the peak of this story was still ahead. It came with the last ruler of the Spanish line, Charles II of Spain. His birth itself was the result of generations of intermarriage. For an average person, a family tree expands with each generation. In his case, the opposite happened. The number of unique ancestors shrank dramatically. The same relatives appeared multiple times in his lineage. As a result, he inherited an extremely limited genetic pool. And the consequences were catastrophic. From birth, it was clear, the child was weak. He was late to speak. Late to walk. His body developed with abnormalities. He couldn't move properly without support. But the biggest issue wasn't physical. It was his mind. He often seemed distant, apathetic, unable to make decisions. In rare moments, he showed clarity, but most of the time, he appeared lost. In reality, he was easy to control. And that became a problem not just for him, but for the entire country. On top of that, he had the famous Habsburg jaw in its most extreme form. His face was so deformed that even eating was difficult. His jaws didn't align. Every meal was a struggle. But the problems didn't end there. He suffered from multiple conditions: epilepsy, bone disorders, fainting, hallucinations. Doctors tried to treat him, but medicine at the time was limited. They even used bizarre methods, including attempts at exorcism. Of course, none of it worked. And despite all of this, one thing was still expected of him: an heir. Because the fate of the entire dynasty depended on it. They found him his first wife, Marie-Louise d'Orleans. For her, this was supposed to be the perfect marriage. She had grown up believing she would become the wife of a great monarch. But reality turned out very different. Her husband was seriously ill, spending most of his time in strange routines and showing little interest in life. On top of that, the Spanish court received her coldly. Political tensions between France and Spain were high. She lived in isolation. Gradually, she fell into depression. And once again, she died. Officially, it was due to illness. But rumors of possible poisoning spread. There was no proof. But the atmosphere at court spoke for itself. Immediately after her death, Charles was married again. His new wife was Maria Anna of Neuburg. She was described as beautiful, but difficult in character. Ambitious. Tough. Cold. But nothing changed. Charles remained the same. Weak, apathetic, unable to live a normal life. There was still no heir. And around the throne, a struggle began. Different factions at court understood one thing. The king wouldn't live long. And everyone wanted control over what would happen next. On one side, his wife, pushing her family's interests. On the other, his mother, with her own plans. Intrigue, pressure, hidden conflict, all of it unfolded while the king slowly faded. He gradually lost his strength. And in 1700, he died. He was only 38 years old. With his death, an entire era came to an end. The Spanish line of the Habsburgs ceased to exist. The very thing they feared most finally happened. The empire they had built over centuries was left without an heir. And the reason was the same strategy that had once brought them to power. Incest, which was meant to preserve the dynasty, ultimately destroyed it. The death of Charles II of Spain didn't end the story, it started a new conflict. A massive empire was left without a direct heir. And that meant one thing: it could be divided. Two major forces formed almost immediately. On one side, the Austrian Habsburgs. Formally, they had a claim to the inheritance, but their position was weakened by complex dynastic ties and the lack of a clear direct line. On the other, the Bourbon dynasty of France. Their case was strong too. Connections to the Spanish court, previous marriages, influence, all of it gave them a solid claim to the throne. While Charles II was still alive, the struggle stayed quiet. Delegations visited him, tried to persuade him, pressured him. He signed documents, sometimes favoring one side, then the other. In reality, the decisions weren't his. They were made by the people around him. In the end, everything came down to the last document he signed. He passed the throne to a Bourbon, Philip V of Spain. And the moment he died, Europe exploded. The War of the Spanish Succession began, one of the largest conflicts of its time. Almost every major power got involved. France and Spain stood together against a coalition that included Austria, England, the Netherlands, and others. Battles weren't limited to Europe, they spread to the colonies as well. Hundreds of thousands of people died. And much of it was the result of a dynastic system built over centuries around marriage and inheritance. In the end, the Bourbons kept the Spanish throne. Their dynasty remains there to this day. And the Habsburgs lost Spain for good. But their story didn't end there. In Austria, the dynasty continued. Although close relative marriages were less extreme there, the consequences couldn't be avoided entirely. A few decades later, another turning point came. In 1740, Charles VI, Holy Roman Emperor, died. He was the last male in the direct Habsburg line. A dynasty that once controlled half of Europe effectively ended in its original form. But the name didn't disappear. Power passed to his daughter, Maria Theresa. She married a member of another dynasty, the Duke of Lorraine. That's how a new branch was formed, the Habsburg-Lorraine dynasty. Formally, everything seemed the same. But in reality, it was already a different story. If you step back and look at the bigger picture, one thing becomes clear. The Habsburgs weren't unique. To some extent, almost every European dynasty was connected. Kings, emperors, princes, their family trees were intertwined, forming a massive network. At times, it looked like one giant family. And in most cases, the system worked. Yes, there were illnesses, complications, complex lines of inheritance, but overall, diversity remained. The gene pool didn't fully collapse into a single loop. That's why most dynasties survived. But the Habsburgs went further than anyone else. They narrowed the circle to the extreme. They turned family marriages from an exception into the foundation of their strategy. And that became their biggest mistake. The paradox is that their strategy was brilliant. Marriages really did give them incredible power. Without massive wars or total destruction of their enemies, they managed to bring huge territories under their control. But that same strategy became destructive. Because power can be managed through politics. But biology cannot. With each generation, the problems grew. At first, slowly. Then more and more visibly. Until one day, it was too late to change anything. The story of the Habsburgs is not just about one dynasty. It's an example of how a system that works perfectly in the short term can lead to disaster in the long run. And it's not just about the past. Even today, marriages between relatives haven't completely disappeared. In some regions, they are still part of tradition. But science has long made the consequences clear. What was once a matter of power and survival is now a matter of choice. The story of the Habsburgs shows what can happen when people try to control everything, even what cannot be controlled. And maybe the main takeaway is simple. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the outside world. It's the decisions that seem the most logical from inside the system. Thanks for watching the video to the end. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already.